Welcome everyone to tonight's Dharma talk. As I mentioned earlier, tonight I'd like to talk about death, rebirth and death awareness. And I guess the reason I'd like to talk about it is because I've found death awareness one of the most valuable meditations there is in the whole array of Buddhist meditations there are. And something about death is that it's the only certain thing in life. I mean, there's a bit of a joke about death and taxes are the only certain things, but in reality, it's only really death that's the only certain thing. And it's certain because we were born. That which arises will also pass away. So all conditioned phenomena are subject to impermanence, and we are impermanent. So the reason why it's good to reflect on death and good to contemplate death, good to be aware of death, is because in our life, if we can be aware of death, it actually helps us live in the moment more completely. It helps us be present more completely, because it's uncertain when we'll die. We could die at any moment. And if we were to die at any moment, we want to sort of make sure that this last moment is a wonderful moment. That's not the only reason why death awareness is wonderful, is fantastic. It is also kind of sobering. It's sobering. We tend to get caught up in and intoxicated with our cravings and our desires and our yearnings and our fantasies about what may be in the future. And in fact, it's being intoxicated with life. If we can reflect on the certainty of death and the uncertainty of when it may occur, it protects us from being intoxicated with life. The Buddha recommended that we do the 5 recollections daily, both for monastics and lay people, because it's a way of becoming sober rather than being intoxicated with our cravings and our fantasies and about the future and what may be out there that we can consume. The 5 recollections are, of course, I'm of the nature to age, I'm of the nature to have illness, I'm of the nature to age, I've not got beyond aging. I'm of the nature to have illness, I've not got beyond illness. I am of the nature to die, I've not got beyond death. I'm not excluded from this reality. All that is mine, beloved and pleasing, shall one day be parted from me, shall one day vanish. And this last recollection is very much about karma. And karma directly translates as action. So I usually say it like, I am the owner of my actions, heir to my actions, born of my actions, related to my actions, abide supported by my actions. Whatever actions I shall do, of those actions I shall be the heir. And of course, we can say this about all beings. You know, these 5 recollections, we can relate them to all beings. So that last one is very interesting. And it relates to death insofar as our actions are the ground we stand on. Our actions are our only true possessions. And I'm just quoting the wonderful Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh there. And in Buddhism, they say that when we die, we can't take anything with us, nothing, except our actions. Except our actions. So just to come back a bit, the Buddha taught about rebirth and conditionality. So rebirth is different than reincarnation. The Buddha didn't teach reincarnation. Reincarnation is taught in a number of approaches to life, and religious approaches and so on. Reincarnation is like we're driving a car, where like our soul is driving, well, say imagine you're driving a car, you drive it for years and years and years and years and years and years and years, and then it eventually breaks down. So you hop out of that car and you go and get another car, and you drive that car for years and years and years and years and years and years, and you just keep going on in new cars. The idea of reincarnation is this personality, this mind-body that we call ourselves, is kind of the soul is transported from one lifetime to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. But that's not the way the Buddha talked about how we are. The way we are, according to the Buddha, is streams of dependently arising processes interacting. We are conditional experiences. We're body-mind streams that one thing leads to another, one thing leads to another, one thing leads to another. And the way we are is dependent on so many causes and conditions coming together, most of which are completely beyond our control. Like the fact, where we're born, the families we grew up in, the environments we were raised in, our experiences through life, even our nations and our cultures, as well as the actions we do. And the actions we do, based on the decisions we make, are our only sense of how we can steer and have any sort of impact on how life unfolds for us, the outcomes of our life. So that's why Thich Nhat Hanh said, our actions are the ground we stand on. Our actions are our only true belongings. And it's like this, we have this analogy of one person going to another car, cars. That's an analogy used for reincarnation. The analogy for rebirth that could be used, and this wasn't the analogy at the time of the Buddha, but analogy that I've heard, and I've used this often when I've tried to explain this, is you imagine you put a line of billiard balls in line touching each other on a table, on a billiard table, and then you go and you get your cue and you hit the white ball at the end of that line, and it's like the white ball touches those other balls, and it's like the ball goes straight through and it comes out the other end. But of course, that's sort of like an optical illusion, really. It doesn't really happen like the ball goes through. What happens is there is a transference of energy. So there's an impact that comes out the other end. And so in that way you could understand the human life. It's not like we're, dying and being reincarnated in another body. It's more that we have this moment-to-moment action and consequence, or action result, or cause result, energetic kind of continuum. It's like a stream, and this stream is dependently arising, and it's interacting. So what we are, is actually nothing. An analogy the Buddha did use was as a flame burns on a candle, and it just burns, and then it's not that the flame is a single thing. It's this changing, dynamic, energetic quality. It burns the candle, which could be a body, for example. Then it catches on fire to another candle. So this analogy of the candle, interestingly, was also used with when the Buddha was asked what happens to the enlightened being at death. And with that question, with physical death, with that question, the Buddha asked a question. He said, well, what happens to a flame? Where does the flame go when it's extinguished? And of course, the flame doesn't go anywhere. It just extinguishes. So the aim of Theravadan Buddhism or early Buddhism, I know there's a couple of schools of Buddhism and early Buddhism, but the aim of early Buddhism for the practice was to not be reborn, to not come back, to put out the flame, basically. The flame is compared to the fuel. The flame is not the fuel. The flame is dependent on the fuel, but the fuel for our flame of life is craving. Like that perpetuates us. And the aim of what the Buddha taught was to put out the flame, extinguish it. And of course, the Buddha taught he wasn't pulled into this idea of eternalism nor annihilation. That's one way of understanding the middle way. Sometimes the middle way is understood as neither the extremes of hedonism or self-mortification. Neither of those extremes, it's in the middle. This is the path, the Eightfold Path. Another way it's understood is as neither the extremes of annihilism or eternalism. So sometimes, there was one time when someone came and asked the Buddha, so what happens when the Buddha dies? Does he go to an eternal realm? And the Buddha didn't respond. And then he said, is there nothing? And the Buddha didn't respond. And Ananda, the Buddha's attendant, came up to him and said, why didn't you tell him what happens? And he said, if I told him, he'd be more confused than he is now. And he'll find out for himself. So he did find out for himself, but it's neither that nor this. It's beyond this idea of nibbana or the goal of the Buddhist teachings is beyond our conditional conceptualization or conditional conceptual understanding to comprehend. It's like stepping out of that whole way of understanding things. So for the Buddha, for those enlightened ones, the flame goes out. There's no rebirth. Now that's according to early Buddhism, a whole different story in Mahayana Buddhism, but I don't know how to explain that. They talk about dying and coming back to save all sentient beings. So the way I understand that is their intentions must be so strong that they just are reborn in a body. So death and death awareness is very helpful for us in our everyday mundane lives to help us become present, to enable us to not be intoxicated with life. And they also help us find what's important in life. What's important in life and what we should do with that in our directions of life. In ACT is, I'm a clinical psychologist, and some of the approaches I use, many different approaches. One approach is called ACT. It's called Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. And in ACT they have these various factors, therapeutic factors. Two factors that I'd like to mention tonight, and I think I've mentioned them on Dharma talks before. It's this therapeutic factor of clarifying one's valued directions. And the next factor is acting on one's clarified directions, one's valued directions. So one exercise they do in that approach, sometimes they give to clients, is to imagine they're listening to their own eulogy. Like they've died and they're listening to someone say something about their lives. Talk about them, give someone a summary of their lives. And the question that they ask is, what do you want that person to say? Here is Malcolm. He worked very hard. He got shingles all the time. He was a really busy guy. He was so busy he didn't have time for his kids. He didn't have time for his grandkids. He didn't have time to give dharma talks. He was just working all the time. That's his life. Or would you like that eulogy to be saying something like, here is, well, I'm speaking about myself here. Here is Malcolm. He devoted his life to dharma. He had a loving family, and he spent a lot of time with all the loving family, doing what he could do to help, and so on and so forth. He gave dharma talks every now and then. So, when you think of death, when you reflect on the certainty of death and the uncertainty of when it might happen, it really sets your priorities straight. It really makes you think, well, what should I be doing right now? And in fact, there's many different ways we can reflect on death, and I gave you an example earlier tonight about breathing in, breathing out as if it's our last breath, and what should you be doing now? And in Tibetan Buddhism, I remember when I practiced along in those traditions, we would often, one death reflection was, given the certainty of death and the uncertainty of when it may be, what should you be doing now? To reflect on that, to reflect on what's really, really important. So, and so that's another benefit of death recollection, death awareness. And yet another way of reflecting on death or contemplating death is by actually imagining you're dying. And this is a practice I've learnt with Analio and various other practitioners. It's imagining that you're going through the stages of death. And in that process, you go through, with the early Buddhist practices, you go through the various elements, and you imagine that the earth element's going and the water element's going. This is what actually happens with dying. Like, we first start to feel, well, I can't remember dying last time, but what I've seen and what I've noticed is that people get very heavy, like so heavy they can't move, and then the water element bursts, like they might, be very, very thirsty or urinate, and it's not a pretty thing when you die, I don't think, but the elements fall apart, basically. So you imagine that happening. And you also imagine letting go of your ego, because that's got to go. That's got to go. So this is a really wonderful practice to do, so that you, in life, because what I do, what I notice when I reflect on death, I think all those petty matters that I'm worrying about, my ego, somebody might have said something terrible about me and I take it on personally. What will that matter in 100 years? So it really clarifies what's important, really clarifies what's worthwhile putting your mental energies into. And it is also being able to be mindful and let go at the time of death is a very powerful practice in and of itself, so that when you're actually dying, it's a very powerful moment, like when you're actually physically dying. It's a very powerful moment to see the deathless. Now, what do I mean by the deathless? I'll explain that in a moment. To see how we have to let go. And when we let go, we are free. It is, I know sometimes I've talked about the 16 steps of mindfulness of breathing. The last 4 steps are related to insight. The last step of that is letting go. So that's the final step before awakening. It's the final step to awakening, actually, to let go. So when we're dying, when we're actually dying, and if we can maintain awareness and notice everything falling away, the earth element, our mind, everything, and not grasp after it, that is a moment of liberation. That's the moment of liberation. So there is a a kind of saying that's with mindfulness-based stress reduction with John Kabat-Zinn. He said this. He said, if you can die before you die, when you die, you don't die. That sounds like a bit of a riddle, but I'll just repeat it. If you can die before you die, when you die, you don't die. What he means by that is that if you can actually let go of the ego, like if you can let the ego die, and when we let the ego die, we realise that what we're clinging to with the ego is just an illusion, really. You know, it's just this conceptual conceit. It's a conceiving, it's self-conceiving, it's the creation of the self. In Pali it's called mana. It's this belief in a self that's continuing on, you know, getting into one body, one life, and then the next body, the next life, and so on and so forth. If we can let go of that clinging to the ego while our body's still alive, when we actually die, we realise there's nothing dying. We realise the deathless. And the term deathless is another way of saying, is another way that Nibbana is described. And it's called the deathless. And it's called the deathless because what we realise in Nibbana is the unconditioned. It doesn't arise and it doesn't pass away. What we realise is beyond the frameworks of the self to understand completely, because it's about death. It's like staring into the sun, and that's the title of a book, Staring into the Sun. That's the title of a book about death anxiety by Yalom, who's a psychotherapist. It's like that. It's hard to do that. It's hard to contemplate our death. But if we can actually let go while we're alive, we experience the deathless. Well, we see the deathless. And that's liberation. That's freedom. So thanks very much for your attention. I hope that it's been helpful. I hope that, and don't take me wrong here, I hope we can die before we die, and then when we die, we don't die. And thank you very much. You could say sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu means, well, I'm not pretending it was all said, but usually after Dharma talks in traditional Buddhist societies, they will go sadhu, 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 which means well said, well said, well said, or well done, well done, well done. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.